The silver tray was heavier than she remembered. Or perhaps her hands were not what they had once been, steadied as they had been in another house, another life. The night everything she had trusted proved hollow. Nora Bassett carried the tray across the long corridor of Ashvale Park, with her gaze fixed on the floor 4 steps ahead of her, as a good housemaid did, as she had trained herself to do across the 14 months she had spent at Ashvale rebuilding the quiet architecture of an unremarkable woman. The spring of 1814 had arrived without warmth, and the great house smelled of beeswax and hothouse roses and the approaching inconvenience of company. Lord Harwick was expected before nightfall. That was all Mrs. Peel, the housekeeper, had said, and Nora had filed the information in the place she kept everything that concerned the master of the house in a sealed chamber inside herself, where she stored what she could not afford to feel. She had never met Lord Harwick. The estate had been in his possession for 9 months, and he had not yet visited it, managing affairs through correspondence and his steward, Mr. Felton, who moved through Ashvale Park with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to the weight of another's instructions. Nora had been grateful for the distance. She had come to Ashvale in the January of the previous year, with a single reference letter and a name that was not entirely her own. Not a false name. She had not sunk to that, but Bassett was her mother's surname, the one she had carried before her marriage, before the months of quiet and then catastrophe that had brought her here. Eleanor, as she had been known in that other life, was another woman now, a woman with a different sort of pain in her chest and a different set of silences to maintain. The tray held a decanter of claret and 2 glasses, a bowl of early forced strawberries, and the Evening Post collected from the receiving table. Nora delivered it to the drawing room, set it on the side table, aligned the glasses, and turned to leave. She was in the corridor when she heard the carriage. She did not look. She kept walking. The footsteps in the entrance hall multiplied, Felton's heavier tread, the butler's careful pace, a third set measured and unhurried, and something in Nora's chest tightened as though a hand had pressed flat against her sternum. She had felt that particular pressure before. Once. She had chosen to forget what produced it. She had reached the servants' stair when Mrs. Peel found her. "Bassett," the housekeeper said, "the master has arrived with a guest. The blue sitting room requires a second tray." "Yes, ma'am." She descended, and then ascended again, tray in hand, and she was already inside the blue sitting room and setting the second arrangement of glasses on the small walnut table when she heard the voice in the corridor. It was not the voice that stopped her. It was the ring. She would not have seen it at all had the door not swung wider than she expected as the 2 men entered, and had the afternoon light not caught the heavy gold band on his right hand at precisely the angle that turned it toward her. A black enamel seal, an eagle displayed with raised wings, a crest she had last seen pressed into dark wax in the candlelight of a different house in a different county, on a night of thunder, and something so much worse than thunder. The ring had been on a table then, removed before its owner had gone upstairs to conduct what he had taken for granted. Nora had run before he reached the top. Her hands did not shake. She had trained herself out of that, too. The man who wore it was perhaps 35 years old, tall in the Regency way of men who have never been told to make themselves smaller, with dark hair that had been cut by someone who understood its thickness, and a face that held authority the way limestone holds water, not aggressively, but as a simple property of its nature. He was speaking to his companion about the east pasture. His voice was measured, low, the kind of voice that had no need to fill a room because rooms rearrange themselves around it. Nora set the last glass on the table without sound and moved to the door. "Leave the curtains," he said, and she understood he was speaking to her. "Yes, my lord," she said to the middle distance. She was in the corridor in 3 breaths. She was at the servant's stair in 10. She stood in the narrow stairwell with her hand on the cold stone wall, and understood that the 14 months she had spent building Bassett, the unremarkable housemaid, had just become a much more complicated calculation. If you find yourself holding your breath alongside Nora already, you are not alone. Stay with her. She had been Eleanor Makepeace for 23 years, and a widow for 7 months before she became Nora Bassett. The widowhood was genuine. Charles Makepeace had died of a fever in the autumn of 1812, leaving her the house in Bath that turned out to carry more debt than square footage, and the discovery that marriage, which she had entered at 19 with the ordinary hopes of a young woman of slender means, had been a careful subtraction rather than an addition. Not cruelty. Absence. Charles had been kind the way certain rooms are kind, pleasant to pass through and impossible to inhabit. She had gone to her uncle in Surrey with what remained after the creditors, and for 4 months she had been the upper sort of poor relation that a house finds its uses for. She had kept the children's lessons, written the estate correspondence, managed the linen inventory, and understood herself to be grateful. She was 26 years old, and she was not unhandsome, which meant she was a problem to be solved. And her uncle had an idea about the solution. Lord Strathern had come to visit in November. He was a baron then, and she had not yet understood what he was, and he had the fine clothes and the easy entitlement of a man who had never been told no by anyone whose opinion he valued. He had looked at her across the dinner table the way a man looks at something he intends to purchase once the price has been agreed. She had not been asked what she thought of the arrangement. Her uncle had informed her, with what he believed was kindness, that Lord Strathern had expressed an interest in her company, and that she would oblige him. She had not run at once. She had waited to understand what was actually being proposed. 3 evenings of Lord Strathern's particular attention had made it clear. On the 4th evening, she had packed what she could carry in a single valise, and she had gone downstairs in the dark to retrieve her winter cloak from the hook in the passage, and the drawing-room door had been ajar. And she had seen on the table beside the decanter the ring he had removed from his hand before ascending. An eagle displayed with raised wings, black enamel, heavy gold. She had known then what she had declined to know across 4 evenings. Not a baron. Something larger. Something whose attention carried a weight her uncle had been counting on. She had walked to the village in the dark and taken the mail coach north in the morning and written to the only woman she trusted for a reference letter that said nothing false, but nothing complete, and she had become Nora Bassett, housemaid, and she had been becoming her ever since. Until now. 14 months was long enough to understand a house. Nora understood Ashvale Park the way she understood all confined spaces, knowing where the walls were thinnest, where sound traveled, which corridor offered the fastest route from any given point to the servant's stair. She also understood, by the end of that first evening of Lord Harwick's arrival, that he was not Lord Strathern. She had established this not by any conversation, but by the careful geometry of observation available to a housemaid who moved through the rooms where men spoke freely, because they did not register her as a listener. Lord Harwick's guest, a man named Mr. Carew with a broad Devonshire vowel, discussed the estate's east boundary question at length over supper. Harwick responded in short declaratives, occasionally asked a question that showed he had been listening, and twice in the course of the evening issued instructions to the footman. Not curt, not careless, not the voice of a man who believed service to be invisible so much as a natural feature of rooms. What she had not established, because she did not know how, was whether he recognized her. She had been in the blue sitting room for a total of perhaps 40 seconds. She had not raised her face directly. She had kept her voice at the level of the decanter and the curtain rod. She had been 26 on the night she fled, and she was now 27. And the difference in a housemaid's dress from the dress of a poor relation staying in a private house was considerable enough that she did not think herself the same woman in any register he might have filed her under. Lord Strathern had looked at her across a dinner table. Harwick had not looked at her at all. And yet, she lay in the narrow bed in the upper room she shared with 2 other maids and listened to the house settle and asked herself a question she had not permitted herself to ask in 14 months. What did he know about what Lord Strathern had intended for her in her uncle's house? The answer she could not afford was that he had known everything. The answer she could not afford to dismiss was that the ring and the man who wore it were connected to that night by more than coincidence, and that until she understood the nature of that connection, she was not safe. She was not the sort of woman who ran without information. She had run once in the dark from a certainty. She would not run again from a question. Harwick stayed 3 weeks. This was longer than Felton had projected, and shorter than the estate's problems seemed to require. Nora watched him the way she watched everything, steadily, at the edge of her attention, with no outward sign that she was watching at all. She observed that he rose before the household, that he walked the south pasture before breakfast in all weathers, that he ate without appetite at supper, but drank his wine with the care of a man who respected it. She observed that he was consistent with the staff in a way that was neither warm nor dismissive, but simply reliable. He noticed when things were done correctly and did not make a performance of it. She observed that the ring was always on his hand. She also observed that he looked at her. Not immediately. Not the first week. The first time she was certain of it was the morning of the 9th day, when she was carrying the post basket along the lower corridor, and he was returning from the south pasture with mud on his boots and his coat open to the cold air. He stopped to allow her to pass, which was the usual courtesy. And then he did not move on at once. And she was 3 steps past him before she registered the quality of that stillness. She did not turn around. On the 11th day, he spoke to her. She was in the library returning a volume to its shelf, her duties on alternate mornings when the main housemaid was occupied with the upper rooms, and she had climbed the small rolling ladder to the 2nd tier and was sliding the volume into its gap when she heard the door open below. She continued with the volume. She descended the ladder. She turned. He was standing at the desk with a letter in his hand, and he was looking at her with the precise, controlled expression of a man who has decided to keep whatever he is thinking entirely to himself. "You have been here some months," he said. "Not a question." 14 months, my lord. Before that. It was not a question either. She understood the shape of it, and chose the answer that was true, and offered nothing. Bath, my lord. Before that, Surrey. Something shifted in his face. Not much. A tightening at the jaw, a fractional narrowing of the eyes. He looked back at his letter. "Thank you," he said, which was not the usual ending to such an exchange, and she left the library with her breath steady and her hands cold and the certainty that he knew something. The question she now carried was the same question she had carried since the blue sitting room. What? His wound came to her not through conversation, but through the house itself, which was the way houses speak when their masters will not. Mrs. Peel was not an indiscreet woman, but she had loved Ashvale Park for 20 years and could not always contain what the house meant to her. And in early April, on a wet afternoon when most of the staff were occupied with the South Wing linen audit, she allowed herself to speak while Nora polished the silver in the kitchen. The Marchioness had died 4 years prior. Not in the house. She had been at her mother's in Dorset, and Harwick had not reached her in time. And there was a version of that journey that the staff believed without repeating it aloud. He had been in London on business that had kept him 3 days longer than he had intended. The message had arrived late. He had taken the fastest road, but it was not fast enough. He had not come back to Ashvale in the 4 years since. He had managed it from a distance, from London, from a house in Edinburgh he had apparently inherited from a cousin, from anywhere except the rooms where he had lived with a woman he had not saved. "He blames himself for the delay," Mrs. Peel said, not looking up from her own work. Though anyone with sense can see the delay was not his fault. Business in London is not abandonment. But sense is not what grief runs on. Nora did not respond. She continued with the silver, and held the knowledge like a stone held in a closed fist, warm from her hand, heavier than it looked. He was not the man she had feared he was. She had known this for some days already, with a certainty that had nothing to do with permission. He was a man with a wound so specific and so private that even his housekeeper could only gesture at it obliquely. He was cold, because grief had made stillness the only safe register. The ring on his hand was not Lord Stratton's ring. The ring on his hand was, it now seemed, a ring that had been in a room on a night when something had happened that she needed to understand entirely before she could decide what she was. She needed to understand what he knew about Lord Stratton. And she needed to understand it without revealing, not yet, that she had been the woman in that house. The conversation happened on the 17th day of his visit, and it happened because of Mrs. Carew. Mrs. Carew was Mr. Carew's mother, a woman of 60 or so who had arrived unexpectedly from Devonshire with 2 trunks and a proprietary ease that suggested she considered the invitation her son had received to extend naturally to herself. She was not malicious. She was simply the kind of woman who had spent 60 years moving through rooms on the assumption that the room would adjust. She had strong opinions about housemaids, which she was happy to distribute. "The girl," she said to Mrs. Peel on the first morning of her visit, within Nora's hearing as Nora was arranging the breakfast table, "has a manner above her station. It wants correcting before it becomes habit." Mrs. Peel's response was the precisely calibrated silence of a woman who had managed houses for 20 years and recognized entitled overreach when she met it. Mrs. Carew turned to her son, who was reading the paper. "Edmund, you agree?" "I agree that my breakfast is very good," Mr. Carew said without looking up. Nora carried on with the breakfast table. The label attached itself the way such labels do. And before the day was out, Mrs. Carew had said it twice more in different configurations, to different listeners, and the phrasing she settled on was "above herself," which contained a whole social theory about what Nora ought and ought not to be. Above herself. The words had a particular texture. She had heard words in that vicinity before, in Surrey, spoken by women who had looked at her too good education and her too direct gaze and decided she was a problem. Above herself, as though herself were a fixed location. And the self that had lived there were a woman who would not look up from a polished table. Harwick had heard it. She knew this because of what happened in the corridor on the following morning. She was carrying a bundle of table linen to the press room when he came around the corner, and they nearly collided. And he stepped aside and said, "Miss Bassett." And she stopped. He had not used her name before. Housemaids were addressed by surname alone, without prefix. The prefix was small and might have meant nothing from any other man in any other house. From him, in this corridor, 3 days after she had registered on Mrs. Carew's list of offenses, it meant something she could not yet entirely read. "My lord," she said. "Mrs. Carew has a habit of forming strong opinions quickly," he said. "I would not have you concerned about them." It was direct, unusually direct. She met his eyes for a half-second longer than she should have, and then looked back at the linen in her hands. "I am not concerned, my lord." "No," he said. "I did not think you would be." He moved past her, and she continued to the press room and stood in the small, cool room with the linen against her chest, and felt something she had not felt in many months, and was not certain she had the right to feel. Seen. Not the way Lord Strathern had looked across a dinner table. Seen accurately. As though whatever he had registered in the blue sitting room and in the library, and in whatever calculation occupied him in the hours between those observations, had produced not a threat, but a recognition. She was dangerous to herself. She understood this clearly. Lord Strathern arrived on the 21st day. He came without announcement, riding up to Ashvale in the afternoon with a single groom, and Nora, who was beating a rug on the south terrace, heard the horses on the gravel before she saw anything. She did not look up immediately. She heard Felton's voice, and then a second voice she had spent 14 months declining to remember, and had remembered anyway, in the way the body remembers without the mind's permission. She folded the rug cloth over the rail and walked back into the house through the servants' entry, and told herself very steadily that she was 27 years old and employed in a house where her employer had already demonstrated, in a corridor with a form of address, that he was not indifferent to her being treated correctly. She told herself this, and believed approximately half of it. What she did not know, and had no instrument by which to measure, was whether Harwick and Strathern were allies or enemies, whether the ring that connected them was friendship, or debt, or family obligation, or something more calculated. Whether the man she had begun, against all her practical intentions, to trust was the kind of man who would hand her over when the question arose. She found out that same evening, and not by design. She was in the passage behind the dining room carrying the first remove to the kitchen when she heard Strathern's voice through the door, which had not quite closed behind the footman. "There was a woman," Strathern said. "A widow, in Surrey. An uncle of hers, Makepeace was the name, had arranged things rather neatly, and then the woman took it into her head to bolt. It made things awkward. You understand?" A pause. "No," Harwick said. "I do not understand." His voice was level. It was the voice she had heard in the corridor, the voice that derived its authority not from volume, but from a precision that left no room for negotiation. "I only thought," Strathern said, and he had the slightly adjusting tone of a man recalculating, "that with a full house one notices these things. There was a girl here this morning who put me in mind of her." "Probably nothing." "Probably," Harwick said. "Shall we have the next course?" It was not a question. The conversation closed. Nora stood in the passage for 3 breaths, and then completed her task and returned to the kitchen and went about the remainder of the evening with a composure she had not entirely earned, but could not afford to relinquish. What she now understood was this. Harwick had heard. Harwick had heard the description, or something close enough to it, and had closed the conversation with a precision that permitted no follow-through. He had not handed her over. He did not know yet that she was the woman Strathern had described, but he had closed the door. She spent that night rebuilding the case for caution from first principles, and arrived at Mourning with a decision. She would not run. Running was what Strathern expected of her. Running was what the machinery of such situations produced. A woman in flight. A woman reduced to her own scarcity of options. A woman who could be recovered or not recovered at the will of men with more resources. She was not going to run. She was, instead, going to speak to Harwick. She had no precedent for this and no protocol. A housemaid did not request a private interview with the master of the house. She thought about it for 2 days, and then she wrote a note. Not to him, but to Felton, asking whether there might be a moment at which the master could spare 5 minutes on a household matter. It was vague enough to be granted as routine. It was granted by the following morning. Harwick received her in the study. He was standing at the window when she entered, and he did not turn at once, and she understood that she had perhaps 20 seconds before the encounter took a shape she had not controlled. She used them. "My lord," she said, "I believe you heard something at dinner 2 evenings ago that you were kind enough not to pursue. I am here to tell you that it was accurate." He turned then. She held his gaze because she had decided, sometime in the second of the 2 sleepless nights, that she was done with the architecture of the unremarkable woman. She had built Nora Bassett with great care and considerable cost, and Nora Bassett had served her well, and she was prepared to let her go. "Eleanor Makepeace," he said, not as a question. "My name before I came here was Makepeace," she said. "Eleanor, before I was Bassett. Both names are my own." "Your reference?" "Accurate in everything it claimed. Mrs. Whitmore knew me well and wrote nothing false." She paused. She did not know why I had left Surrey. And the reason. It was not a question either. He seemed to ask few questions by nature, preferring the declarative form that put the weight of response on the other person. She had noticed this. She understood now that it was not coldness, but a kind of economy, a refusal to use more words than the situation required. "Lord Strathern," she said, "had been led to expect access to my company by my uncle, who had calculated certain advantages from the arrangement. I was not consulted. When I understood what was expected, I left." "In the night." "In the night," she agreed. "On foot. The ring was on a table in the drawing room. I saw it as I passed. I had not known before that evening what his rank was. My uncle had been careful about the introduction." Harwick said nothing for a moment. He had the quality of stillness she had identified in the blue sitting room. Not distance, but contained force. The way a room holds its temperature, rather than losing it to an open window. "You have been here 14 months, he said. "Yes." "And you have not left?" "No." "Why did you not leave when you saw the ring on my hand?" This was the question. She had prepared for it. She had, in the end, prepared something very close to the truth. "I wish to understand what you knew of it," she said. "And I wished, if I were going to run again, to run from a certainty rather than a question." Something moved in his expression. Not the jaw set she had learned to read. Something else. Something that might have been in a different register and a different setting. The early shape of grief's releasing. "I wore that ring at my uncle's specific request on the 3 occasions when Strathern was a guest at our house," he said. "It is the Harwick family seal. My uncle was attempting to produce the impression that Strathern and I were allies in a venture involving several of us. We were not. We are not. I ended the connection 8 months later, when the nature of his habits became clear to me through a source I will not identify here." Nora said nothing. She was translating the information very carefully against the architecture of what she had believed. "He will," Harwick continued, "not be a guest in this house again after this visit. That was already decided before you entered this room." "I did not come to ask for that," she said. "No," he said. "I know what you came to ask for. You came to know whether you were safe." She was not going to cry. She had not cried about this particular situation in 14 months, and she was not going to begin in a study in Northamptonshire in front of a man she had known for 3 weeks. She held the warmth that had risen in her chest at bay by the simple mechanism of pressing her left hand against her side beneath her apron, where no one could see. "Yes," she said. "You are safe," he said. His voice was exactly level. "You are safe in this house for as long as you choose to remain in it." She believed him. This was the most alarming thing that had happened to her in years. Strathern left Ashvale the following afternoon. Nora watched from an upper window as his horse moved down the gravel drive and out through the park gate, and she stood there a moment longer than she needed to, and then went back to work. What followed was not immediate. Nothing in Ashvale moved at speed. Harwick himself moved at a kind of considered pace that was not hesitation, but the step of a man who had learned that arriving too quickly at a destination could mean arriving too late. He asked her to walk with him, 3 days after Stratton's departure, along the South Terrace, not as a housemaid summoned on a household matter. He said, in the corridor near the kitchen stair where she happened to be standing, "Miss Makepeace, would you walk with me?" And she understood from the name, from the first name she had abandoned, that he was not speaking to Nora Bassett. It was April, and the air had softened slightly, and the South Terrace looked out over gardens that had been designed by someone who understood the particular English quality of a landscape that appears accidental but is entirely composed. He told her, without prompting, about the east boundary matter he had been discussing with Mr. Carew, and she responded not with the deflections of a housemaid, but with the direct observations of a woman who had managed an estate's correspondence for 4 months in Surrey and knew the difference between a tenant's complaint and a structural problem. She saw his attention sharpen. "You are not what you appear," he said. Not critically. "I am exactly what I appear," she said. "I have been, for 14 months, a good housemaid. Before that, I was a woman of moderate education and no fortune and some practical skill, and I am still that woman. And before that, a wife who was not unkindly treated and not much seen," she said, which was the most honest thing she had said in 2 years. And she felt the lightness and the weight of it at the same time. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the garden below the terrace. "My wife," he said, and stopped. She waited. "My wife was not unkindly treated either," he said. "I was not present when she required it. That is a different sort of absence from yours, and the same in certain ways. You could not have known the fever would come," she said. "No," he said. "But I was 3 days late." She did not tell him it was not his fault. She had heard that said to people in grief, and had observed that it accomplished very little. She said instead, "She must have known you would come." He was still for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "I do not know that." "A woman knows," she said, "the difference between a man who would come and a man who would not." He turned and looked at her then, directly, without the management of expression that she had catalogued across 3 weeks. She held the look. She was 27 years old, and she had run once in the dark, from a situation she had not chosen, and she was not going to look away from something she was choosing freely. "I have been considering," he said, "a question of some significance, and I do not know whether the timing is appropriate." "It may not be," she said. "No," he said, "it may not be." He looked back at the garden. "I am prepared to wait for appropriate." She allowed herself to feel the warmth of that rather than containing it. She pressed her hand against her side and let the warmth stay. If this story has found you at the end of a long day, leave a word in the comments for Nora. She has been waiting 14 months for someone to use her real name. She deserves to be acknowledged. There followed 6 weeks of something that had no proper name in the vocabulary available to them, because the vocabulary available to them was governed by what Nora was on paper and what Harwick was on paper, and the considerable distance those papers put between them. He was a Marquess. She was, on paper, a housemaid. The distance was not metaphorical. It had practical weight, social machinery, a whole apparatus of expectation that neither of them was under any illusion about. And yet he walked with her on the South Terrace on 4 separate mornings, and they talked. And what they talked about was not always significant in the way of estate business or personal history, but sometimes simply the quality of the light over the garden, or the particular stubbornness of the east pasture's drainage problem, and Nora found, to her careful alarm, that she was no longer afraid of being seen by him. She was afraid of something else entirely. He had not touched her. He had not made any gesture that overstepped the precise line between consideration and something more costly. This was not, she understood, absence. This was what she had observed in the command as protection of his brief, precise instructions, what she had read in the form of address in the corridor, the manner of a man who understood the weight of crossing a particular distance and was not willing to cross it without knowing what was on the other side. She respected this. She also found, on an evening in late April, when he was late returning from the east pasture, and she was aware of the exact location of the study window from the kitchen garden below, that respect had become the thinner of the two things she was managing. Mrs. Carew had departed Ashvale on the 1st of May, having exhausted both the hospitality and Mr. Carew's patience, and on the morning of her departure, she stopped Nora in the entrance hall with a look that catalogued Nora's dress, her posture, and her expression in the efficient way of women who have spent 60 years forming verdicts. Above herself still, Mrs. Carew said, not unkindly now, but with the certainty of a woman who considers accuracy a courtesy. A housemaid with opinions is a difficulty, Miss Bassett. You would do well to remember your station. Nora said, "Good morning, Mrs. Carew," and held the door. She did not look at Harwick, who was standing at the foot of the stair. She heard the carriage pull away. She heard his footstep on the marble. "Miss Makepeace," he said. "My lord," she said, still looking at the door. "Your opinions," he said, "are among the things I rely on. I should like you to know that." She turned. He was looking at her with the same controlled expression and the same quality of contained force. And she thought, with a clarity that was almost comical, that she was going to have to do something about this herself, because he was not going to move without permission, and she was the only one in this corridor who could give it. "Then I will give you one," she said. She held his eyes for 3 full seconds. She did not look away. "I think," she said, "that there is something here that is not employer and housemaid, and I think we have both known it for some weeks, and I think the kindness of not acknowledging it has reached the end of its useful life." He was very still. "Yes," he said. That was all. "Then," she said, and she did not finish the sentence, because it did not require finishing, and because what happened next was him crossing the hall in 3 strides and taking her hand, the bare one, the one not holding the cloth she had been using to polish the door handle, and holding it in both of his without gloves. She felt his pulse against her fingers. She was not certain the pulse was entirely his. "Eleanor," he said. Her first name. The one she had buried. The one she had not heard in his voice before. "Harwick," she said, which was not quite conventional, and was entirely what she meant. There was a great deal still to be done. She understood this with the practical part of herself that had managed 14 months and a false name and a valise packed in the dark. There was the matter of her situation as it stood on paper, and his situation as it stood on the wider social map, and there was his solicitor in London, and there was the question of what a formal announcement would require, and there was the question of Mrs. Carew, and the wider question of what a Marquess marrying a woman who had been employed in his own household as a housemaid would look like in the county records and in the drawing rooms of the season. None of this was simple. She knew it. He knew it. They stood in the entrance hall with her hand in both of his, and they both knew it very clearly. "It will occasion comment," she said. "It will," he agreed. Lady Finmore at the summer assembly will say that you have taken leave of your senses. Lady Finmore, he said as much when I refused to sell the East pasture to her brother. I survived that. She felt the warmth again, and this time she let it stay entirely. There is also the matter, she said, of what I am. On paper. On paper, he said, you are a widow, one Mrs. Makepeace of Bath, with a household reference from a Mrs. Whitmore of Surrey, and 14 months of exemplary service in this house. On paper, you are also, if you will permit it, the woman I intend to marry, which is the only paper I am presently concerned with. She had held herself together across 2 years, and a flight in the dark, and a name not entirely her own, and a man's hand on a table that had sent her walking into the night. She had held herself together through Mrs. Carew and Lord Strathern in the corridor, and 3 weeks of building back the case for cautious distance, and 6 weeks of walking on the south terrace with a man she had tried, without success, to distrust. She pressed her free hand flat against her ribs, and breathed, and held herself together still, but only barely. Yes, she said. Yes, he said. And the sound of it in his low voice was the beginning of something she had not anticipated being given the chance to choose. The summer assembly at Ravensfield was the occasion that the county had been waiting for, though the county did not know yet what it was waiting for. Harwick attended, as his position required, and Nora attended on his arm, which was not yet what the county had been arranged to expect, and which produced in the first 7 minutes a redistribution of expression across the assembled faces that she observed with a steady attention. She did not allow to become visible as anything other than composure. Lady Finmore, in the third cluster of guests near the west windows, said to her companion something in a voice pitched just below audibility. But her eyes were on Nora, and the content was legible without sound. The companion, a younger woman named Miss Daventry, turned with the swift alert look of someone who has been given information she does not know what to do with. Harwick had not hurried. He moved through the room at his own pace, which was also Nora's pace, and he spoke to whom he chose to speak to, and introduced her when introduction was called for. And when Lady Finmore came to him at the center of the room with the practiced warmth of a woman recalibrating quickly, he was perfectly civil, and Nora was perfectly composed, and neither of them was arranged the way Lady Finmore had expected. Miss Bassett, Lady Finmore said, the name a test delivered as a greeting. Mrs. Makepeace, Harwick said without inflection, and Lady Finmore's expression did a small, precise thing in the vicinity of her eyes. Makepeace? Not Bassett. A different sort of name, a different set of implications. Nora held the room's attention the way she had once held Mrs. Carew's correction and Lord Strathern's assessment, steadily, without either defiance or apology. She was not performing composure. She simply possessed it, in the way of women who have had to build it from the ground up, rather than inherit it. The announcement came from Harwick at the supper interval, when the room had collected itself into its natural clusters, and the first pleasantries were giving way to the more specific commerce of a county assembly. He did not deliver it as a speech. He said to the small group nearest the supper table, in a voice pitched to carry without announcement, I should tell you that Mrs. Makepeace has done me the honor of agreeing to become my wife. Lady Finmore's fan stilled in her hand. Miss Daventry, to her credit, said, How wonderful, and meant it. The room rearranged itself in the particular way of a room that has received information it had not predicted, and is now engaged in the rapid work of deciding how it was inevitable. Nora watched this process with the recognition of someone who had seen rooms perform it before, in smaller configurations, and understood that the room was usually, in the end, sound in its verdicts, when finally awakened. Mrs. Makepeace, Harwick said in a lower voice, meant for her alone. My lord, she said. You are steady, he said, which was observation rather than reassurance. "I have had practice," she said. His hand was at her elbow. The ring was on his hand, the black enamel seal, the eagle with raised wings. She had last looked at it from across a kitchen passage 14 months ago, with her heart against her ribs, and all of the architecture of Nora Bassett assembled between herself and what she could not then afford to feel. She looked at it now and felt nothing that required a sealed chamber. She felt only the warmth of his hand through the thin silk of her sleeve. The wedding was in September, at the parish church near Ashvale, in the presence of the household staff and a small number of county neighbors who had decided, in the weeks since the summer assembly, that Harwick was the sort of man whose judgment one trusted precisely because he did not make his choices for the room's convenience. Mrs. Peel was present. Felton was present. The vicar, a Mr. Colby who had known the estate for 30 years, performed the ceremony with the uncomplicated pleasure of a man who sees, occasionally, a situation resolved in the correct direction. The evening after the ceremony, when the small supper had concluded and the household had retreated to its own celebrations below stairs, Harwick and Nora stood in the study where she had first spoken plainly to him in the morning light. He was at the desk. She was at the window, looking at the darkened park. And he came and stood behind her, not touching yet, in the way of a man who still, even now, asked before crossing a particular distance. She turned. She had had, in the pocket of her winter cloak since the morning she left Surrey, a small thing she had collected almost without deciding to. A folded card, her mother's handwriting, a recipe for something warm that her mother used to make on winter evenings in the house before the house was gone. She had kept it through the mail coach and through Bath and through the creditors and through the months with her uncle and through the night with the valise, and she had kept it in the pocket of each successive coat through 14 months at Ashvale. It was the only thing she had carried from before. She had not told him about it. She had not told anyone. She took it from the pocket of her wedding gown now, the folded card, worn soft at the creases from 2 years of being held without being read, and she set it on the edge of the desk between them. "My mother's handwriting," she said. He looked at it for a moment. He did not pick it up. "You have kept it all this time," he said. "Yes." He looked at her, not at the card, and she understood from the quality of that look that he had had, perhaps, something similar. A thing kept from before. A particular piece of before that had not become the past because one had not been ready to let it. The fire behind the grate was steady and low. Outside the window, the park was entirely dark. The house was quiet in the particular way of a house that has received something it was waiting for. "Eleanor," he said. "James," she said. His first name, which she had learned in the wedding ceremony and had not yet used, and found now that it fit the room exactly. He picked up the card. He set it back on the desk. He offered her his hand. Bare. The ring on his finger catching the firelight. She took it. She had run once in the dark from a ring on a table, and she had carried the memory of it for 2 years, and arrived through 14 months of careful becoming at a room where the ring was on the hand of a man who had already, in a corridor, in a library, in a study in the morning, and in a county assembly hall, confirmed the same thing in every register available to him. The fire settled. The room held its warmth. Outside, somewhere in the park, an owl sounded once and was quiet. Eleanor Harwick, Marchioness of Ashvale, stood in the study with her husband's hand in both of hers and understood that she had not, in the end, become someone else. She had only, in the long route through the dark, become herself entirely. If Nora's story stayed with you, leave a word below for her. She earned every letter of her name.